Welcome to the Honest Reflection Podcast with your hosts, Cody Hairston and Nick Woods. Here, we want to help you reflect on your week and be honest about your relationship with God. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hey guys, we're glad to have you listening into another episode this week. As usual, if you like what you hear today, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share with your friends. Nick, how's it going this week?
Good. It's been a good start to the week, or I guess a good week after the holidays and getting into it's just kind of like we are at our house, it's birthday season. So mine was last week and then we got two this week. And so it's just kind of like celebrating birthdays this week, but it's been a good week. It's been a blessing to be able to celebrate time with our friends and family over the past couple of weeks. And so it's all good. How about you, Cody?
Been good. Just realized I'm a bad friend. Didn't wish you a happy birthday, man. Happy belated birthday. But things are good over here. Obviously, we just finished up the Thanksgiving holiday, and Christmas will be here before we know it. But it's that cool in-between season where you're coming off the one holiday, but clearly about to ramp up for something. In some ways, even a little bit more involved. But it's all good. God is still good. I am super excited about today's chapter. We're going to have Hebrews chapter 11. And so it's my day to read today. So I'll go ahead and start reading Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1. Now, faith is the reality of what is hoped for and the proof of what is not seen. For by it our ancestors won God's approval. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. By faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was approved as a righteous man, because God approved his gifts. And even though he is dead, he still speaks through his faith. By faith, Enoch was taken away, and so he did not experience death. He was not to be found because God took him away. For before he was taken away, he was approved as one who pleased God. Now without faith, it is impossible to please God, since the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith, Noah, after he was warned about what was not yet seen and motivated by godly fear, built an ark to deliver his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and set out for a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. He went out, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he stayed as a foreigner in the land of promise, living in tents as did Isaac and Jacob, co-heirs of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself, when she was unable to have children, received power to conceive offspring, even though she was past the age, since she considered that one who had promised was faithful. Therefore, from one man, in fact, from one as good as dead, came offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and as innumerable as the grains of sand along the seashore. These all died in faith, and although they had not received the things that were promised, but they saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents on the earth. Now those who say such things and make it clear that they are seeking a homeland, if they were thinking about where they came from, they would have had an opportunity to return. But they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promises, and yet he was offering his one and only son, the one to whom it had been said, "Your offspring will be traced through Isaac." He considered God to be able even to raise someone from the dead. Therefore, he received him back, figuratively speaking. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and he worshipped leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, as he was nearing the end of his life, mentioned the exodus of the Israelites and gave instructions concerning his bones. By faith, Moses, after he was born, was hidden by his parents for 3 months, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they didn't fear the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and chose to suffer with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. For he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be of greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger, for Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. By faith he instituted the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch the Israelites. By faith they crossed the Red Sea as though they were on dry land, and when the Egyptians attempted to do this, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after being marched around by the Israelites for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute welcomed the spies in peace and didn't perish with those who disobeyed. And what more can I say? Time is too short for me to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the lions' mouths, quenched the raging of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, gained strength in weakness, became mighty in battle, and put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead, raised to life again. Other people were tortured, not accepting release so that they might gain a better resurrection. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, as well as bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they died by the sword, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and on mountains, hiding in caves and in holes in the ground. All these were approved through their faith, but they did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, so that they would not be made perfect without us. So, Nick, that was a lengthy reading there, but God's word is always good to read and to hear. So would you mind kind of going back and giving us a breakdown of the chapter?
Yeah, it's good, and it's always. I agree with you. I'm glad we're kind of reading through the text this time. It's really good to hear it, to read it, to be in the Word as much as we can. I was thinking about the breakdown of this chapter, and this is just from my mind a little bit, but also just kind of gives us an organizational tool to kind of think through what we're reading. But it was kind of from a different perspective this time, and I noticed kind of a different thing. We talked about that, but I think like verses 1-7. You see faith and how faith was exercised before the promises to Abraham. Those really significant promises that God makes in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1-3. But all of these stories kind of take place before that. And these people lived before that time, but there was still a way to have a relationship with God. Verses 8-22 is the connection to the law of Moses. Really, it's before that law is in establishment. So really what you have is Abraham and Sarah, and then you have a little bit of Joseph, a little bit of Jacob, Isaac. You have some people mentioned kind of there at the end of it. And what we see so far through the first 22 verses is faith is God's way for us to see his righteousness, to live his righteousness. And it is all about us believing him and that he's able to reward us. In verse 6, it says, faith says that we don't belong in a place that's separated from God. We really were created to be with him, and we trust that, and we want to live that way. And we start to see that with Abraham, and we see the desire for a heavenly place. You noticed as you were listening, I'm sure, all the different types of dwellings that were mentioned in that section: the city, the homeland, the desire for being with God. Verses 23, through 38. Then really you see Moses come into play, and so maybe the law hasn't quite been handed down yet, but then Moses is connected with the law in the Hebrews' mind, and so here is how faith can be lived out by people who were living under a law, and that's significant, and it dictates that we should obey God's law. It's given to us for the benefit, for our good, in that time under the Old Covenant, and faith through the Old Testament looked different, maybe in the way that it was deeper than just strict law keeping. One of the things that we'll talk about and maybe notice in that is there was suffering, and there was sacrifice, and there was individual desire to live a certain way because of a desire to be with God. Moses trusted God enough to leave Egypt and live as a wanderer. So that's kind of we'll see that a little bit more as we discuss. And then the last two verses I kind of sectioned out as kind of their own thing, but it's really connected to the first 3 verses of chapter 12. It's just pointing us to Jesus. Those who lived before Jesus did not see the fulfillment that Jesus brought, the fulfillment of faith, the completion of their faith. It was all pointing to him. Christ unites us all in having faith in the promises of God. And that's kind of the connective tissue to our faith and their faith, and why this chapter has been used so much, right? This is it has all kinds of nicknames, right? The Hall of Fame of Faith. Here are the faithful people who've lived, and these are the stars of the Bible, or whatever we want to think of. It's there's actually a deeper and more significant message that's being laid out by the Hebrew writer here. So how do you want to tackle it today, the chapter, Cody?
Yeah, I think we'll use a little bit of the outline that you gave there. I imagine a lot of these stories are familiar to our listeners. You mentioned how y'all just seem like the Hollywood stars and whatnot, and I kind of liken Hebrews 11 to that, where if there was there were Hollywood stars for Bible people, a lot of these names would get mentioned there. You know, Abraham, Moses, Jacob. Like these are David doesn't even really get a lot of FaceTime here, but these are people that we know and whatnot. But what we do want to be able to focus on, since we're not really going to be able to dive deep into each and every person, what we want to be able to highlight is the faith and the endurance that some of these people displayed, because I do think that's what the Hebrews writer is trying to emphasize as he's listing all these names. He's not just saying, hey, yeah, let's just think about these cool people from the past. It's like it's for a reason. He's been talking about endurance really in the whole book, but especially recently back in chapter 10, verse 36, for you need endurance so that after you've done God's will, you may receive what is promised. And so all of these people that we just read, they had endurance and they had done God's will. Faith in the last verse of the last chapter, verse 39 of chapter 10, but we are not those who draw back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and are saved. And then this chapter it answers the question like, okay, well, what does it look like to be one who has faith and is saved, right? All of these people kind of fall under that category. So I think what we'll do is we will use the general sections that you gave out. So 1 through 7 before Abraham, and then 8 through 23, the stuff that happens with Abraham, and then 24 and onward is the Moses under the law parts. We'll just take a person or a verse or two from each section that gets mentioned and just kind of highlight their endurance and highlight their faith. For the first section, 1 through 7, before Abraham, I really like Abel's story. Verse 4, by faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was approved as a righteous man because God approved his gifts. And even though he's dead, he still speaks through his faith. So in the story back in Genesis 4, he offers the best and most acceptable sacrifice to God. And Abel ends up suffering greatly for that, right? Because Cain kills Abel because Abel has the good gift. And it's not because Abel was gloating about it or doing anything wrong. He's being righteous, right? He's being faithful to God. And because of that, because he was that way, well, he ended up losing his life. But what made the sacrifice good and acceptable? We actually don't have a lot of the ins and outs of what exactly everything was, but Hebrews writer says it was his faith, right? The offering was offered in faith, and it wasn't that Abel followed like everything according to the specific command, because it's not like in Leviticus how it says, oh yeah, for the grain offering you do this, okay, and then Abel did this, and this, right? We don't have anything like that, right? We just know that Abel had faith in God, and so he offered the right type of sacrifice. He trusted in God enough to give him his best, to not worry about where is this stuff going to go and what's God going to do with this. He just said, you know what, you're God, I trust you, here it is. And so his faith was on display here, and he was approved for it, he and his sacrifice. But there's a lot of endurance, and he ends up suffering because of it. What are you seeing in these first 7 verses?
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think there's a connection to Abel and Enoch, because it says that God was well pleased with Abel's offering. And then it talks about Enoch, not in Hebrews, but in Genesis. And then in Hebrews here, it connects Enoch to saying that he was obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. This is what he was known as. He was known as somebody who was pleasing to God. And I think that kind of like outlines faith, because what we get in the first 7 verses that really like is fascinating to me in this section is we get these definitions that like our trust in God is being confident or assured or certain, right? So we are assured that the promises are true. That we have this assurance of hope, and that's the expectation of God's fulfillment, and that itself is an assurance. We're convicted by that. We're moved by that. We're convicted even though we don't see it, right? And then like you kind of looked and spoke to it with Abel. We see it even more with Noah, right? Noah is assured that God will keep him safe, and he's convicted to act on that when God tells him to build an ark. It says he was warned by God about things not yet seen. In reverence, he prepared an ark. And reverence is this idea of faith, right? faith lived out really looks like reverence, I think. And so what we see is, again, in verse 6, faith is believing not only that God exists, but that he is able to reward those who are seeking to be in his presence. And I think that's the context: diligently seeking him, seeking to be with him, to have a relationship with him. And so I think this frames the whole understanding of the actions of faith we see in the rest of the chapter. And I think what we see in Noah is kind of a typical expectation of God. This is what faith can be. And so you see it with Abel, Enoch, Noah, but you have this, there's nothing visible except that they trust God and they're certain, they're confident that he can keep his promises. And then we kind of get into chapter 8, verse 8. So what do you see in the next couple of verses there?
Yeah, the section that's Abraham and all the things that happen there. Again, whether I like how you broke it down. You got pre-covenant and post-covenant, but even just thinking about it all together, I think Sarah is notable here in verse 11. By faith, even Sarah herself, who was unable to have children, received power to conceive offspring, even though she was past the age, since she considered that the one who had promised was faithful. So I like it on one hand because, clearly it's like God was working through her faith. It's not that she believed and then all of a sudden, like, boom, she's having all these kids, but it's like because she believed, God was able to work through her and work with her to bring about all these wonderful promises. I also think she's a great example of endurance because, I mean, she kind of wait till she's 90 to have a child. They're already out not on the run, but on the move. And that's, when I'm 80, 90 years old, I'm not going to be traveling around in tents or anything like that. So there's endurance that's there. And really there's a lot of ups and downs in their story. As they're out moving towards the promised land. Granted, some of them are self-inflicted, but still, like she is able to endure I would say the natural progression of faith of like, okay, sometimes things are going really, really well. Sometimes things are not going real well, but she keeps coming back and choosing God. And I really like this story because it shows that faith and faithfulness is like a big picture thing. Because we actually know about some of the doubts that both she and Abraham had regarding having a child, because they're 90 and 100 years old. In fact, that's why Hagar, the mistress, even gets involved, because they were like, oh well, I mean, she's younger, she'll be able to have a kid. I'm not going to be able to have a kid, right? So there's a little bit of doubt there. She literally laughs when she's told that she's going to have a child, and it doesn't sound like it's like a laughter of joy. It's like a laughter of like, oh, that's preposterous, and so there were doubts that were there, but when we get to Hebrews 11, she's just faithful, right? She had enough faith that all of this was able to happen, and so I do think that there's probably a good lesson in what do we do if maybe we haven't demonstrated faithfulness in a particular moment. Well, what we need to do is we need to be faithful moving forward. Right, because that's what faithful people do. Even if there's a valley, a low point in your faith journey, if that's what you want to call it, well, faithful people bounce back, and that's what we see with Sarah. She was faithful, even if there were doubts. She chose God, and so because of that, God ended up choosing her. So, what do you see in that section?
No, as you kind of get to the end of that section, you see Abraham's faith exemplified in this story where he offers Isaac. And it says this in verse 19: he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which also he received him back as a type. So again, pointing to Jesus, right? That's the language that's being used there, is Jesus is the fulfillment of that type. But Abraham had, to our experience, to our reading in the scripture, when you're reading through Genesis, nobody's been raised from the dead yet. And there's a lot of people who have died at that point in the scripture, right? So this thing that Abraham believes God can do in Isaac is not something that he's ever witnessed or seen. And so he's walking through this thing, and to your point, this endurance, he's not shrinking back as we end chapter 10 in Hebrews. He's not shrinking back in a lack of faith, but his faith is propelling him into courageous obedience. And so I think we see that it's not something that he had a reason to believe. And I think that's what stands out with like Noah and this particular thing with Sarah and Abraham is there wasn't proof. there was trust. And so there is like, I want to have proof that amplifies my trust in God, but I want to trust God because of who he is most. And I think that stands out too in this chapter. Then you see Moses's mother, right, who protects her son. And I love that picture because we're like, I think the implication is that she trusted that they were going to be a great nation. There was some remnant of the promise to Abraham that was lingering in her heart that caused her to hide her son and have courage against the king of Egypt. And so you kind of like put all these pieces together, you're seeing this thread of how great the promises of God weigh on the hearts of the faithful. Like it is everything to the heart of the faithful. We trust that he can do what he said he's able to do. And so then we kind of like dive into this next section with Moses. So Cody, what do you see there?
Yeah, I see a lot of what we saw in the previous sections. It's interesting. It doesn't matter what time period we're talking about, before the law, during the law, before Noah. Like it's all about trusting in God. And like you said, some of these people, they don't have like the physical, tangible proof about some of the promises, some of the things that are coming down the line, but they know God. And it's like, that's all the proof that they need. They're like, well, God will figure out the details. That's why Abraham's like, yeah, I mean, maybe he'll raise Isaac from the dead. Never seen that, but I'm sure he's got something up his sleeve because he knows God. He knows God is faithful. And that was a verse from one of the previous chapters in Hebrews. It's like, he is faithful. There's nothing more binding than him saying something. And so, yeah, if God says that all these promises are going to come through Isaac, well, even if Isaac's gone, he's going to find some way to make sure these promises come through him. And you see that same type of faith with under the law, where there are people who have to do some things for the Lord, even though, maybe your human instincts might say do something other than that. A lot of this section is about Moses and his faith. You already mentioned how his parents showed their faith in protecting him. But even Moses, he chose to be with Israel instead of living a cushy life in Pharaoh's palace, which like all human instincts would say, well, you know what? Do I want to be with the slaves or do I want to be in the king's palace? Like, I want to be in the king's palace. But no, he knew that being with God and his people, that's really where it needs to be. And the story continues to go into talking about, the plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea, and even some of the early stories of people marching around the walls of Jericho and the walls coming down, and even non-Israelites like Rahab are involved there, and they're demonstrating their faith. So there's all these like really amazing things that happen. People are fighting battles, and it's awesome. But not all the stories are quite that glorious. I think about verse 35. It talks about how some were tortured and scourged and stoned and sawed in two. Some folks lost their lives as a part of their faith and their endurance. And so this faith manifested itself in a little different way than maybe what we saw with Moses or Abraham, but it's the same faith that Moses and Noah and Abraham and Abel all demonstrated. And I do think mentioning these people who lost their lives would have really hit home for the Hebrew listeners, because they were enduring hardships, right? They are going through difficult things because they have chosen Christ. And presumably, I think that's why they wanted to go back to Judaism. They wanted things to be easy again, things to go back to normal. And the Hebrews writer is saying, like, no, like, if you want to be like Moses, well, stick with Jesus, endure, be faithful, go through these trials, because you will come out right on the other side. And I think there's probably a wonderful lesson for all of us as far as sticking with God when things get tough. So is there anything that stands out to you as we wrap things up?
No, I just the last two verses, right? I mean, faith continued throughout the Old Testament, as you pointed, in the same way that it had continued in the beginning, right? With Noah and all these, like, it's the same faith. And I love that statement that you made, because I think that's one of the points also, is that the Hebrew, like you said, he's trying to speak to these Jewish Christians and explain to them that like what they need is to have this faith in Jesus, because that's the fulfillment of God's promises. This is the thing that all of their ancestors have been looking to and expecting and waiting on. And so then you get these last two verses, and it's all these having gained approval through their faith. Yes, their faith was what gave them their approval in God. They didn't receive the promise, but we have. And that's how he ends in verse 40, kind of pointing us to Jesus. God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Like their fulfillment of their faith, the thing that they were expecting, is the thing that we have in Jesus. And it's through Jesus that we are connected to them. And that faith is what that binds us. It's all about trusting God's promises, being somebody who is completely given to knowing that God is true. So I think we see that, and as we kind of think about that, we see, and we get into chapter 4, Jesus is fulfilling the faith, and he is the one who has faith. So, Cody, wrap us up with our reflections this week.
Yeah, I think we should just think about, how can we stick with Christ this week? Sometimes faith in Christ calls for a lot out of us, just like faith always has. It may be at work, it may be with our family or other places that we might be. But the good thing is that God sees it all, right? There's that song, the all-seeing eye watching you, right? A lot of times people think about that in a bad way, but it's like, no, like that's a really good thing for the faith. Like the things that I do that no one else ever sees, God sees those things. Like Jesus says, he sees what's done in secret and he will reward that. So God, he grants us approval when we demonstrate this faith, regardless of what it looks like, regardless of the context that it's in. And so even if you've had a rough go at it lately, I would say if you're still choosing God, you just keep it up.
Thank you for listening to the Honest Reflection Podcast. If you like this episode, give it a like, a share, or even a comment to let us know how we're doing. We hope we've helped you think, reflect, and be honest about your relationship with God, and we can't wait to see you again next week.